This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to Roots and All, where my guest this week is David Hedges-Gower. David is a prominent figure in the UK's lawn care industry, known for his expertise and dedication to promoting sustainable lawn care practices. He wrote the book Modern Lawn Care, is the chairman of the Lawn Association, founded the world's first lawn care qualification, and works tirelessly to promote responsible, sustainable lawn care practices that benefit the environment and homeowners. What David has to say on lawns certainly challenged my notions about what lawn care involves, whether they're a sensible option to those concerned about wildlife, and what they can and should be like from a horticultural perspective. So listen on with an open mind.
I left the school premises fairly early because I was going to be an engineer. Decided I didn't really want to do that before I even went. Got a job as an assistant professional golfer. That career sort of ended relatively quickly at the same time as me sort of going into golf course maintenance. I wore my elbow out, essentially. I then sort of done 25 years in sort of golf course maintenance, ending up as superintendent at the Oxfordshire Golf Club, one of the world's most famous, I suppose, back in the 90s anyway. And then I sort of got to 40 and I kind of went, I don't want to do this for any longer. I hit the sort of fairly much the peak and then sort of thought, well, okay, well, let's look at something different. And I also realized that I only knew a lot about grass. So I sort of went into lawn care, and I suppose in some respects I had to prove myself, which I found quite alarming, really, because I'm thinking, well, I could look after grass more than anyone in this sort of gardening industry, but no one knew me, and you sort of had to prove it a little bit. So I wrote a book and said, well, there you go, that's what you're not saying. It got reviewed well. It got shortlisted at the Garden Media Guild Awards, even though strangely nobody had read it, which was a bit odd, but there you go. That's another story. And from there, really, I suppose it's about getting your voice known enough. And I think when you're in lawn care, you realise that, you know, we don't have the platform of things like the RHS or the Chartered Institute of Horticulture, all these different bodies of gardening. Lawn care sort of sits somewhere over there in the corner, and it's a bit like the annoying cousin that turns up every now and then. And all right, we'll talk about it, but yeah, wiggle it with a fork, you know, scratch it with a Springbok rake, and yeah, everything will be perfect. So yeah, it's been that sort of frustration to try and educate people in probably what's the easiest plant to grow on the planet.
Yeah, you're right. Lawns do sit, I think, off to one side, and maybe they're considered the preserve of somebody who specialises in lawns. But certainly in horticulture, I mean, in my experience and through my training and networking, I would say that in recent years, it's mainly been lawns become an issue when people are talking about them in a negative sense and they're kind of bashing them. They don't have, I don't think, a great image at the moment, and yet they are such a large part of our gardens. And do you advocate for lawns? And if so, you know, why? I'm assuming they have their uses and it's just beyond kind of that amenity value. Is there anything else that lawns are good for?
Lawns are under attack enormously, and that comes from within horticulture. And I think, you know, from my perspective, I've looked very objectively at the whole sort of spectrum of lawns and, you know, where they've come from, you know, who started the trend of lawns, because, you know, everything's a trend these days. Lawn care was a trend. And, you know, one of my bugbears, I suppose, is that the trend has come from commercialism. When you know, if you're as old as me, you remember a company called Levington's or Fison's. And they're sort of now run by Evergreen or ICL, whoever you want to call those companies. And, you know, they started a trend where, I mean, you know, back in the 60s, for example, even in the 70s, lawns were just pieces of grass. Nobody cared about them. You know, when commercialism or these companies that I just mentioned grabbed an opportunity to set a trend. Lawns became this wonderful thing, this thing to add value to your property, to annihilate everything in it and have this perfect lawn idea. And I've looked at it and said, well, the perfect lawn does never exist. I've looked after turf that is better than anyone can imagine, to be honest. And I really mean that. And that's not bragging. It's just during my period of golf course maintenance, I suppose, we were at the top of the world. We were certainly one of the biggest clubs in the world, one of the most manicured in the world. But I still did everything with sort of soil biology in mind. We had a principal object there was to obviously sell memberships and have TV tournaments, all that kind of thing. But when you looked at the plant and the lawn and the grass itself, you kind of looked further afield and went, hang on, this is a really important plant. If you've got a plant that covers 27% of our planet in various guises, don't get me wrong, it's a pretty damn important plant. So we should look at it for what benefits it does. It feeds us, it's in construction, it's all sorts of things, let's say, food production itself, cattle and so forth, they all eat grass. It's just how we manage it has been completely corrupted by sort of commercial revenues, I suppose you'd call it.
I guess there's that perception that lawns are high maintenance, particularly at any sort of scale. I'm guessing that is not your point of view.
My point of view is really that lawns shouldn't have chemicals thrown on them. We've got a plant, and if everybody thinks of it in a very different way, we've got a plant that shuts down when it gets hot. We all worry about this climate change, and some people believe it, some people don't. We all get pushed the idea that we're going to have to change lawns forever, and maybe that is the case, although it certainly doesn't look like it this year. But I think that we have to work with nature, and I think we have to nurture lawns in the same way. The strange thing, and again, this is me being very much a grass nerd, is, I went with my daughter to the Lake District last summer, I think it was, and it was a little bit moister up there, I would say. But we walked up the mountainside, and we got to a point halfway up. This mountain was obviously cared for by sheep, not by humans. And on this sort of little plateau, there was this sort of bit of carpet, I suppose you'd call it. And I stopped and went, there you go, let's do a video right here. Because look at that. There's no weeds in this. No one's irrigating it except Mother Nature. It's getting fed by that sheep over there. It's getting mown by that sheep over there. And that's better than most people's lawns. Now, if you think of that objectively, you think, well, crikey, if that's true, and obviously we have huge amounts of areas of grass that do tend for themselves. They might have, let's say, cattle, they might have sheep, they might have horses, but generally they work on the soil biology principle. They excrement on the floor, the soil biology improves, the plants improve. So I sort of try and get people to replicate that, not by putting sheep on their grass, don't get me wrong. But the philosophy behind soil biology and plant health is quite in front of us all the time. The problem is that in terms of commercialism, we're not sold that. In fact, we're actually sold a system of failure in lawn care, hence why it's such a big commercial industry. And you're going to ask me what that is.
Yeah, exactly that. I am going to ask you why many lawns are set up to fail.
The simple fact is that, we've got two main native grasses in the UK. None of them are sold in the turf industry. None of them are sold in the seed industry. In fact, in the seed and turf industry, we're sold a grass which was essentially cattle food. So we get sold this grass called ryegrass, dwarf ryegrass. It used to feed cattle, and seed companies bred it to make it a bit finer and nicer, and it's used in our football pitch industry. Now, if you know our football pitch industry, although these pitches look quite nice and tidy and for about 7 months a year, they're also ripped up every 7 months and a new one put down. So it works. That grass works in that big area of I'd say FA, Premier League, FIFA pot of gold that they seem to have. So it does work. So when you take that grass and then put it into lawns and then realize that this plant, one doesn't turn into two plants ever. The key to any plant is for it to care for itself, develop itself, tiller, thicken, all on its own. We got it in a hedge, for example. You wouldn't plant a tree to make a hedge. You would plant something like a box plant or something where when you cut the top, the sides thicken out. That's what we have on lawns prior to the 1990s. But since 1990s, commercialism has sold us this grass, which is destined to fail, absolutely destined to fail, and does, and is part of the reason probably why plastic grass has been taken on in new builds, because you've got the wrong plant in the wrong place. And of course, nobody sees it because nobody says it either, apart from me.
A lot of people will inherit these lawns then that have got the wrong mixture of species and that are kind of limping along, propped up with all sorts of various inputs. And if you do find that you've inherited a lawn like that, is there anything you can do? Can you kind of bring it back, or should you start from scratch? How would you amend it?
I think one of the problems is, and this is where the system of failure works, is that they then, bring out wonderful phrases like fast germination, lawn repair, all these sort of wonderful terminologies, which resonate in people's head. Go, well, oh yeah, my lawn's failed, so I need something that's going to germinate quickly. Well, the thing that's germinated quickly is the same grass that's just failed. Like I said, we all assume grass is grass, but we got three species in this country. Two are native, and one bred to fail. But it's everywhere. So if you've got a heavy wear, that's a perfect example of clever PR. If you've got a heavy wear grass, we assume that when our lawn's thin and bare, it's down to the amount of running we do on it, or the herds of cattle we let on it, or whatever. But it's not. It's just this plant dies off. It doesn't like dryness, and it doesn't like lawns that you don't feed, for example. So when you have these sort of lawns, you have to be a bit obsessed with them to keep them good. You've got to oversee them pretty much every year. So the carbon footprint of that failure is not particularly good. As I say, in the football world, it doesn't matter. It would to me, but it doesn't matter to them, because they're all after this big pot of gold, which gets thrown around every football pitch in the country, including plastic being stitched into them as well. But when you put it into a domestic lawn environment, you have to remember, when you go to, just an example, a National Trust property that's been there for hundreds of years, they're all native grasses. They're not cared for immaculately, but they're cared for enough that the soil biology is good, because the property's been there for some time. The soil biology is all working well, and then you got the right species on there, so they look quite manicured in many respects, but they're not. I visited many national trusts through my advisory and consultancy, and nobody really does much work. But this plant, this native two species that we have, fescues and bents, they work for us, which is totally different to ryegrass, where you tend to work for ryegrass because you have to keep replenishing it all the time. And like I say, it's a system built on failure, and it's quite sad, really. The fact that we've had to, the Lawn Association, who I'm chairman for, we're bringing out our own seed mixture, which is just native grasses, because you can't buy them anywhere. Weird, isn't it?
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. If you wanted to establish a lawn that was bents and fescues, could you buy a seed mix, or could you buy it as a turf mat? But obviously not.
Well, one of the things that we've done at the association is try and get, because you've got to think about different, where do lawns fail? And I think when you look at it from the 1990s, when the commercial side of profit making, I'd call it, started to really sort of kick in, that's when you start to see lawns fail. So if you're back in the 80s and 70s and 60s and your house is older and that, you've probably got native grasses already there. Obviously, in the new build section, you start to go, right, okay, so lots of people do new builds. You've got landscapers, you've got probably a few garden designers working for property companies, and then of course we've got a whole garden design community. So what I did recently was look at the lawn spec for garden design. This is from the Society of Garden Designers. And when I looked at it, I kind of fell over. I kind of went, my God, I don't know whether this was written 50 years ago by a 14-year-old child or something, but this is terrible. It was again using the wrong plant. It's not talking about any form of drainage, any form of this. So in terms of where we think, well, where we're trying to work is going, well, okay, new builds have got to learn a lesson. The trouble is they're very entrenched in their current one, which is deemed towards profit, failure, and running away, I suppose, once the turf's been thrown down on the new build. So in terms of grass seed and that sort of failure, one of the benefits, if there is a benefit, is that the lawn when you use ryegrass generally will die off fairly well, especially if you don't irrigate it, for example. It will die off and disappear. The other mixture that they put in these turf and seed mixes is fescue, which is one of the native species. However, you've got two contradictions here. You've got one species that likes drought and dry weather, and you've got one that loves tons and tons and tons of water and fertilizer. So they contradict each other. So what normally happens is either areas aren't irrigated, so the ryegrass disappears and the fescue thrives, or vice versa, it gets irrigated an enormous amount and then the fescue dies, leaving the lawn quite thin and open. So it does give you opportunities. In fact, we've just done a YouTube video on my daughter's lawn last Wednesday. And it was a ryegrass lawn built by a garden designer who probably lacks knowledge when I go back to that specification sheet. And when you think about it, you should have some sort of lawn person who designs a specification for garden designers. You can't expect garden designers to know that. Nobody trains anybody in lawn construction. It's sort of, well, it's brown side down and green side up. What's more do you need? But of course, the next 10 years, you get lots of different things happening within a lawn, be it surrounded by concrete and staying too wet. There's lots of things that you can do to make that lawn survive and therefore become more sustainable for the future, whichever way you want to make it look.
And in terms of sustainability, it sounds as if, I think, again, part of the backlash against lawns has been the fact that people perceive, rightly or wrongly, that they are high input, and that obviously depends on how they're set up in the first place. But do you think that if we did establish them in a correct way, using the right plants for the right place, and didn't kind of overfeed them and didn't fall into all the other traps that we're kind of seemingly set up to fall into, that they can actually be a sustainable, low maintenance part of the garden?
Well, with the right species, and you get this, I kick against the no-mow May a little bit, because not that I have a problem with it. I just think, well, if you're going to do no-mow May, then do no-mow 11 months, 30 days a year. So, have it as a meadow or wildflower. However, when you have ryegrass, you can't do that. It'll just turn into a complete jungle, because this grass just grows vertically. However, when you get a native blend, so when you see these beautiful meadows and beautiful gardens that have different mixes in, where not necessarily your choice of an immaculate lawn, but you don't really want to annihilate weeds, you don't want to annihilate pests. You have to have those grass species, because you can allow them, the flowers, to grow. We did a video on our YouTube channel just recently. We've got a dog lawn out the back here. And what we tried to show people were 3 cutting heights as an example. We've got meadow as well, but so we cut one area at 25 mil. We got the right plants here, by the way. That's all we do. We fed it on the 14th of February. And from there, we've never irrigated it, no weed control. So we cut one at 25 mil, one at 40 mil, and one at sort of 55 mil. So the 25 mil is really nice and a bit carpet-like, if I'm honest, which is sort of one type of lawn that you can have. Then the 40 mil is a bit longer, or it's not, it's not as pristine, but it's got a few weeds that allows it to come in. Then you go on to the 55 mil height, and there's wildflowers and dandelions and just a mass of weed coming in. So, but without the tons and tons of vertical growth that you get from the ryegrass. So using this type of grass is the only way that you can sort of create these different types of lawn without having to change your mixtures or worry about irrigation or whatever, because you can still have quite a nice lawn and not irrigate it. You can put some patterns in for 10 months a year, and if it burns off, it'll still come back, and it can still be a nicely maintained piece of grass, if you like. So sustainability is important, and there's different levels. I'm a great believer that we talk about sustainability in horticulture, but truthfully, not many people adhere to it. I was talking to Andrew Fisher-Tomlin of the London College of Garden Design the other day about plastic pots, and he was quite strong about that as well. I said, what do you think about it? I said, there must have been trillions of plastic pots in gardening over the years, and nobody really, we rattle a cage occasionally, but it doesn't really sort of stop, does it? And I think that's very much the same with lawn. The only way we can do it with lawns, and we've done it to a degree, is that we take stuff off the shelf and then you have no choice, which is a good way. But we still got it, believe it or not, with polymer coated fertilizer. That's another sort of silent danger out there that's been used in horticulture for more years than I care to remember.
Yeah, there's an awful lot of greenwashing. I think designers and maintenance people are constrained by the client at the end of the day as well. They're constrained by having to make a living. They're constrained by the products that are available. There's so many things, that, as you say, fully agree that we try and be sustainable, but actually we've got such a long way to go that sometimes it's a little bit scary. The focus for the podcast quite often for Roots and All is wildlife gardening. And I think, again, people will kick against a lawn because they will say that it doesn't have a lot of value for wildlife. I'm sure I've been guilty of saying that in the past. In your opinion, are they useful in any way?
Are they useful? Well, I suppose, again, you've got to look at the purpose of a lawn. We didn't sow most of the lawns. They've probably just been there and have been put into a garden somehow, or built around it. So, and same with all the mountains, the fields and everything else. When you think about it, nobody's overseeded those. They just naturally occur. And it naturally occurs because it's a plant that likes to grow, and it does an enormous amount of, in fact, it takes in more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere than trees. So even in that respect alone, and the fact that it's obviously pumping out absolutely tons and tons of oxygen, you kind of think, well, there's limits. And don't get me wrong, I'm not an advocate for saying everybody should have a lawn like Bill Gates did with a computer and all that kind of thing, but they play an important place within our gardens and within our environment. I don't think there's never a reason to have it, but there's never a reason to have anything. You can say, well, take a garden out and replace it with concrete, because that'll save you all those trips to a garden centre, for example. So I think lawns, if you have the right lawn, like mine, for example, I've never travelled to buy anything from a garden centre in my life, because the grass actually does all the work. It's the correct plant. It does all that for me. And I think, like I say, the problem with the sort of new lawn obsessives and sort of manicured ideas, I think they're not great for the environment, full stop. I think the way we manage them can be a little bit in between. I do think that, like I say, they do lots of other things. Obviously, they retain soils, they protect our soils, they do a culmination of different things. They're air conditioners within our garden. They do lots and lots of benefits. But I think, like I say, for too long, we've been learning through commercial gain. We've got lawn experts everywhere, apparently. You type in lawn care into Google, it comes up with like 1 billion pages. Now, to me, that either means that everyone's got an opinion, or we're just amazingly clever lawn experts. And my personal opinion is that people don't know how to look after lawns at all. Some lawns will look after themselves. As I say, these traditional old lawns do look after themselves. Some people will probably just mow them and, have weeds and flowers growing in them, and they still look quite pretty. So yeah, it's always, it's a little bit difficult to say, should you have one, should you not? I personally think they've got a good part to play, but I do think that we need to reassess how we maintain them. It's a weird one. I've always said, if I did a lecture and Monty Don did a lecture on lawns, for some reason you'd have more people turn up to a Monty Don lecture than me, which is part of a strange fact, I would think. I'm not sure what you'd learn with him, but I can guarantee I can teach anybody anything about how to make lawns grow naturally, how not to use chemicals on them ever, and how to still get them playing an important part within your garden if you feel that you should. But it, like I say, it's not for everybody. I do agree with that.
I think loads of what you've said is really surprising. And I like to think that I know a bit about gardening, but I really feel that your perspective on it and your information is really, really of value. If people wanted to find out more, what would you recommend? Where would be a good place to start?
Well, the purpose of the Lawn Association itself, which, as I say, I'm sort of chairman of, one, we've got a learning course on there, which is probably the most comprehensive learning course available. And what we do, we look at working with different people that have the same sort of objectives as us. So we work with companies like Stiga, who are very driven towards battery power rather than petroleum and things like that. We've got fertilizers made from composted recycled food waste, which sounds really awful, but it's actually used at places like St Andrews golf clubs. It's probably one of, if not the best fertilizer soil conditioner. Look, the reason we use things like that is because we're conditioning soil, pure and simple. The key to all plant health is conditioning soil. So the Lawn Association's got many sort of avenues, but we're there to help. We've like I said, we've just redesigned the lawn spec for garden designers, which hopefully be taken on. We'll obviously we're working with lots of different companies to do further training, where we use all the sustainable aspects of constructing a lawn, how you can use better products, work on soil biology, all these different things. We've got YouTube channels, which again, you can't teach everything on YouTube, as you well know, although obviously some influencers and everything try to these days. But everything's around simple, sustainable lawn care understanding. It's very, very simple if you know what plants you're working with and how they grow. If you don't have that, which I'd say 99.9% of gardeners I meet probably don't know or couldn't identify our two main species, which is, it's a bit like me not knowing what a rose bed is, I suppose, or a rose plant, for example. So yeah, we've got lots of different social media channels and all that kind of thing, but we've got really sort of, like say, the learning course. We've got a new learning course coming out for the basic homeowner, where it's going to be more adhered to that sort of new build monstrosity, where we can try and turn those around with obviously better species, things like that. So yeah, there's plenty of avenues to find us, put it that way.
A very big thank you to David. I like to have my assumptions about gardens challenged, and I feel like David did just that for me. Thanks to you as well for listening. I'll leave you with Dr. Ian Bedford, talking about the scourge of the conker tree.
We'll all be well accustomed to recognising the signs and signals from nature that one particular season is coming to an end and another is about to begin. Many will be measured events, such as the appearance and the disappearance of migratory animals who follow specific climatical conditions, whilst other signs will be clear and obvious, with the appearance of certain flowers and fruits. One sign, however, is a dramatic one that for thousands of years will have reliably informed civilizations throughout the temperate world, that they should now be prepared for tough winter months ahead. And this is when the leaves on deciduous trees begin changing from green to orange, red and brown, as they stop producing food and are drained of their chlorophyll. So it's perhaps rather puzzling that over the past 2 decades, this irrefutably dependable sign of autumn has been thrown into disarray by vast numbers of horse chestnut trees throughout Britain that now display their autumnal leaf colours during the height of summer. First noticed on a tree in Wimbledon during 2002, the phenomenon has steadily spread to horse chestnut trees throughout England and Wales, and is now beginning to appear in Scotland. However, taking a closer look at the affected trees reveals that their autumnal colours are actually the result of something living inside their leaves, which, as it eats its way through the cells within the leaf, creates oval-shaped, light brown patches that over the summer become so numerous that most of the tree's leaves become completely brown and shriveled. So who is the culprit? Well, it's the leaf-tunnelling caterpillars of an invasive little orange and silver-coloured moth called the horse chestnut leaf miner. The adult moths will have emerged to mate in late spring from pupae that overwintered on the ground amongst leaf litter. Each female moth will then have laid around 150 eggs on the horse chestnut's fresh, unfolding leaves. The tiny caterpillars that hatch from them then burrow into the leaves and start eating the cells within. Then, when mature, they tunnel out again to pupate on the outside of the leaves. With up to 3 generations being produced over the summer, the tree's leaves become progressively more damaged until they finally drop in autumn. Although there's no treatments to effectively control infestations of the leaf mining moth, we're not overly worried about them for the time being, since the infested trees are continuing to grow, flower and produce their conkers as normal. But it's the long-term effect that we can't be too sure of, which could possibly make horse chestnut trees more susceptible to other diseases. We also don't know much about the moth either, since remarkably, only 17 years before it first appeared in Britain, it was discovered in Macedonia and found to be a totally new species that had never been recorded in the world before.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.